your church is hosting our times together, and just appreciate the opportunity to share some of these things with you. And it's really nice when they actually invite you to talk about separation, okay? Because then most of the time, honestly, that's not something I'm doing when I'm an evangelist going into a church and trying to, straighten their separation out. That's not my role as an evangelist. There's a whole other topic there. But when you're asked to share your philosophy, and I think that is a special opportunity for me to share with you why I'm doing what I'm doing in a lot of these decisions. And specifically in the area of worship, I would love to have been able to spend more time on this, but I want to just say a few words here before I get into the meat of what I'm going to say today. The area of worship to me is a very defining issue. I do believe that, especially in our sphere of influence decisions, it will limit our associations in a lot of cases. And I know that it's interesting how we've kind of come full circle in our conservative world, where for many years I kind of felt like we had handled the worship war, and I felt like most people in our movement actually agreed that the style of music communicates and it's not neutral. And for many, many years, we had lots of amens on that, right? And it almost is like we're rethinking. We're coming full circle, and we're rethinking that whole issue of the neutrality of the music style. And I just want to say a couple things about that, because I actually believe that philosophically that is the question that needs to be answered. We may disagree on what the music sounds mean, but what we need to unify on is the fact that they do mean something either helpful or not helpful, something worldly or godly, something sensual or something heavenly. Okay, so we can agree on, we need to agree on the fact that the music itself is communicating something to us, not just the lyrics, not just the experience. And what I'm saying to you is, sad to say, in our movement, that whole discussion is happening all over again, and there are high-level musicians that are not affirming that truth. They're basically articulating that the communication or the meaning of the music is in the experience. In other words, your experience might be different than my experience. So the experience of the listener, and that takes us into a whole discussion on like the cultural ramifications of it. Like, you grew up in this place or in this type of situation, then that music may experientially speak to you different than it speaks to somebody else. But so they're going to say, and I would agree, that there is some communication in the experiential area, but that's not the primary communication. So they're going to say that and this, by the way, is the primary teaching of the contemporary pop Christian culture, is that the meaning is in the lyrics and the experience. And what I'm saying is that now we're rethinking that in conservatism, and a lot of people are not standing on the actual style itself communicating. The actual sounds, musical sounds communicate. Now, I would love to spend the entire time on this. I just want to give you a couple things you ought to ask people. 2 questions you ought to ask people when you start talking about pop music in the church. Number 1, you should ask them, do you believe, if you take away the lyrics, do you believe that the music actually communicates? It actually communicates something to you. You know what I found? When you ask that question, most people actually say yes. Most people actually say yes. So the only other option is to say no, which if you say no to that, now you would be launched into a whole discussion to try to showcase that actually the entire world recognizes that musical styles communicate. All right, and then you could try to, but you don't even need to go there if they already agree with you that they communicate. And I found that actually the majority of people I talk to, they actually do believe, if you strip away the words and from the lyrics from a song, that the actual sounds are communicating something. Now, it's very hard to delineate what they are communicating. It's really kind of subjective in some cases, all right? So the second question that follows that up, and I think this just helps them to see that you're just trying to help them communicate about it. I mean, just engage in conversation about it. The second thing then that obviously has to be asked is, what is it communicating? What is it communicating? And maybe even the word how. How is it communicating? And how do you determine, these are questions that we as Christians need to discern. How do you determine what a musical style, what musical sounds are communicating? And this goes to the heart of what we talked about when we talked about discernment. How do we determine something like this that is in what we would call the subjective cultural category? And then just have conversations about that. I don't think it's necessarily the best way to just go tell somebody that they're wicked because they listen to CCM. I don't think that's, is it true that maybe somebody is using false worship when they worship with CCM? That might be true to you personally. You've come to that conviction. But it definitely doesn't help to start the conversation by kind of attacking them. And basically telling them that for the last 10 years of their life, they've been using worship that is false. You're wicked. I think we need to learn how to communicate about the issue. I learned this many years ago from my good friends at the Wilds, that a question stirs the conscience and accusation stirs the will. Maybe you've heard that before. A question stirs the conscience and accusation stirs the will. And so I am absolutely opposed to using pop cultural styles in worship of the church, which is why I already told you with my sphere of influence that I actually do things that are really safe. And that means I try to be careful not to use music that is associated with, in a dominant or current dominant association way, because associations, whether they're intrinsic or whether they're learned, they do matter. There are intrinsic associations that immediately when a song is played, we have certain feelings. That's intrinsic in the music. There are learned associations based upon something we've heard or seen or read or whatever. And but those associations do matter. Okay? So I wanted to just say a little bit about that because I think that there's probably a line that has to be drawn in our hearts and minds as leaders as to where can we agree to disagree, and where would we draw a line to say, the sphere of influence decision, I cannot participate in that ministry or cannot support that ministry because of their music. Okay, it's a different subject than kind of what we were talking about doctrinally, but it's very similar in the sphere of influence decision. All right, let me go away from that particular subject and let me do a couple more things that I hope will be helpful for you. Colossians 2 verse 8 says, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." I want to say to all of us as ministers that are leading in ministries, the number one thing that needs to lead our ministry is philosophy. I'm passing on things that have been taught to me, and I thought that everybody knew these things. I learned this years and years ago, and have been practicing what I'm about to share with you since then. I learned this from the staff training at the Wilds Christian Camp, what I'm sharing with you right now. And that is that the first thing in our ministries that has to be solid and unchanging and unwavering is our philosophy. And if we were to use this word to describe the philosophies of the world, we would say they're doing what they're doing because of money, which is called materialism. They're doing what they're doing because this word answers the question, why do we do what we do? Why do we do what we do? They're doing what they're doing because they love themselves. Pride. Humanism, right? That would be humanism. They're doing what they're doing because it's just fun. It's pleasurable. Hedonistic philosophy. Okay? Hedonism. So we have all these words that end with ISM, these philosophies. Those philosophies mean something. And by the way, the scripture says in Colossians 2, like I just quoted, that we ought to beware that we are not spoiled. That word spoiled does not mean like something spoiled in your refrigerator. It means to be taken away as a captive, captivated by it. The world's philosophies are invading the church. They're invading the church in so many different ways. Pragmatism, doing what you're doing in your philosophy because it seems to be working. And the classic example is, I can get more people to come to my church if. That's the wrong question to be asking. That's the wrong way to think about it. That would be pragmatism. Humanism, invading the church, big time. When it becomes all about the hero worship, it becomes all about the big name speaker. I think this is a significant problem in the mega church movement, because you have churches now that they don't even have a live pastor. They have the pastor that's starting at the first church, the big church, and now he's planning all these virtual churches, and everybody's in a sense following the man. I think that we all have to be careful that we're not following men and movements and ministries, but we are following God. So that would be kind of a humanistic approach. I definitely think that hedonism is invading the church when we are basically surveying the audience to find out what they want in the church. And by the way, you guys are familiar with a name, Bill Hybels. You know that he came out and actually said it didn't work. Everything he taught and everything he did at Willow Creek, he actually looks back now and says, it wasn't right. It wasn't the right philosophy. It didn't work. Okay, but he basically started this idea of the church marketing, that we give people what they want. That's pleasure. We want them to feel good. We want them to enjoy. That would be a kind of a hedonistic approach to ministry. All right, so everything that we do in our ministry, we should have a strong philosophy, and that philosophy must be based obviously on what? Bible principles. Bible principles. I'm so thankful that my parents taught me in our home. It wasn't just, here's what we expect of you. It was like, okay guys, let's sit down. Let me show you why we do that. Let me show you a principle. And my dad would even say things like, now you may not always do this. You may not even do this later in your family, but I want you to know why we're doing it in our family. I want you to see this verse, and you may not see it this way all the time, but this is why we do it. And we would open our Bibles. We would sit around the table and we would talk about, the different things that were happening in our families. We need to link what we're doing back to the scripture. But I think that this is really important, that the very number one thing in our ministries is why we do what we do. We should be building our ministries on philosophy first. All right, number two. Some of you have probably seen this before. It is not a revelation, okay? People. Starting with we the people, starting with us as leaders. But how do you determine, like if you're a church that doesn't have a pastor, how do you determine who your pastor should be? Who your leader should be? Well, you want to look for people that what? You want to look for people that support your philosophy. I've seen this tragically happen in a lot of ministries where there's some dynamic person that they really, really want. And that person doesn't support completely their philosophy. And at first, and maybe even for a few years, it seems to work, but then all of a sudden, this person starts to undermine their philosophy. And then, we could all give testimonies of this, right? Where a church is no longer standing. I'm not just talking about minor changes. I'm talking about like major changes based upon the people that they brought, that they didn't check them out thoroughly to make sure that they were in agreement with their philosophy. So what happens a lot of times is we think we've got to get the big name person, we got to get the people right so that we can attract more people. Number 3, programs. Okay. So I think that the programs often are going to depend upon what people you get. You want to utilize their gifts. You want to utilize where they're skilled. You get somebody that just seems like they really, really connect well with the teens, and they stand strong on your philosophy, they're connecting well with teens, then you might want to take that person and see if they'll volunteer to help out in the youth group. And maybe you don't even have a youth group. You could go to that person and you could say, hey, I'm so thankful you came to our church, you agree with our philosophy, you are really good with teenagers, let's start a program. Well, I will tell you something, it's pretty dangerous to start put this at the top. And you're building your whole church on programs. You don't have a right philosophy for the program, you don't have the right people for the program, but you just want to get another program started. I think that you need to be careful that the programs are built upon the philosophy and the people that God has given you. And then number 4 would be the facility or the place. Right? Which is the last thing that's important in the ministry. Now, let me just flesh this out for you in like my ministry. We have an awesome campus, but you know what? Our campus has never had an auditorium. Do I want to have an auditorium? Absolutely. If any of you want to donate $10 million, we'll build a nice auditorium. And you know what? We've been doing all of our chapels for years and years and years in the gym. It kind of feels like you're in high school still sometimes, right? But it's okay because there are lots of schools that actually have way more beautiful campuses than we do. But it's okay because I don't really want people to come to our school because we have an awesome place. Do I think that the place should be a hindrance? No. I think we should keep up the facilities. I think we should do the best we can with the finances, and if God ever gives us the finances to build a nicer facility. But when I'm recruiting and I talk to parents, I say, listen, I want you to know that we really don't want you to come to Maranatha because we're in Wisconsin and we get a lot of snow. The weather is actually a hindrance. But you're not choosing your college based on the weather. A Christian parent should not be choosing where their kids go based on the weather or based on the facility. And even in the college, the program. I will tell you, I'm so blessed to tell you and humbled to tell you that I have communicated stuff like this to families. And I'm thinking particularly of a family that is from the state of Oregon. And they were looking for some particular specified programs for their children. And when I started talking to them about our philosophy, all of a sudden they're like, hey, is there any way they could get something similar? And you know what? They're at our school now, and they're in programs that probably are not the exact particular program they were looking for, but because that family agreed with our philosophy, and when I talked to them about philosophy, they were like, wow, this is where our kids need to be. And they said, we're not going to send them to the other places where we've been looking, because we can't afford for them to get a wrong philosophy. Okay? Do I want to have all kinds of programs? Absolutely. We're adding programs pretty regularly. I already talked about this, but you want to make sure, especially as you get higher in the leadership of any institution, any church, like your deacons, your assistant pastors, elders, whatever, that you want to make sure those people understand your philosophy and they are in agreement. In general, you're never going to have like perfect 100% agreement on everything. I'm just talking about if there are central things in your philosophy that you have deacons and elders that don't agree with, you're going to have contention and division. So you want to get people that are supportive of your philosophy, all right? That's just a simple thing to think about. I want to go to one more final thing, and I know we got lunch coming, so that's another. I had to preach before supper yesterday. And this is more teaching and instructing. I know that. There's plenty of other messages I would love to share with you, but I'm trying to help you along these lines of the separation issues and the ministry issues. So I've drawn two parallel lines on the board, and those parallel lines are representing what I would call the banks of fundamentalism. Because what's in the middle is the river. I don't know if you've ever used this illustration. I found that this is helpful for me in my mind. All right, the river, I'm going to say, is here. All right, so here's the right bank. Here's the left bank as you're looking at it. The river is is the river of fundamentalism. Conservative, separatist, fundamentalist, historic Christianity would be in this river. I want to state right at the very beginning, my goal in life is first of all to glorify God. Amen? One of my secondary goals, which I do believe glorifies God, is to stay balanced in the middle, if I can say it this way, in the middle of the river. As the old song says, keep in the middle of the middle of the middle of the road, right? Have you ever heard that Negro spiritual? Keep in the middle of the road. Now that sounds really nice, because then you can kind of get along with a lot of people. But remember, you're still in the road. You got to be in the road. I already showed you there are certain people that are not even in the road. Right? The unbeliever, and I would say the unbeliever and the disobedient brother are not in the road. Now watch this. There are unbelievers and disobedient brothers on the left side of the bank. But hold on, are you ready for this? We don't like to talk about this, but guess what? There are unbelievers and disobedient brothers on the right side of the bank. All right, so if I'm going to name a disobedient brother on this side, which I've already done, then the classic example here is Jack Hiles. Classic example that I am not comfortable putting him in the stream. I'm sorry but I'm not comfortable with saying that kind of radical, right-wing, hyper-fundamental philosophy is really in the stream that I'm comfortable swimming in. So, I hope that that's understandable. I'm trying to use what I actually believe that's kind of an extreme illustration, and that most of you probably agree with me on, is that, he has proven that there's some significant, major problems. And you know what I found when I talk like this, whether it's about this issue or about the music issue, we should evaluate our music in the church on the right side and the left side. We should evaluate this type of situation on the right. I found that when you showcase that you're actually not just trashing people that you or talking about people that you believe are looser than you, but you're actually talking about people that claim to be fundamentalists, that you should see there's a problem with, that the younger generation really goes, you know what? They're sincerely trying to do the right thing. They're not just trying to hang out with people that claim to be in the stream. All right, hope that makes sense. So I'm going to put the X here because that's where I want to be. I do. I want to be balanced. Everybody thinks they're balanced. I want to be right in the middle of the stream. Now, inside this stream, we have people that are on the right side, which rightfully so, we're going to say are maybe more conservative than me, on more strict, more higher standards, higher expectations, drawing tighter lines than me. On the left side of me, there are going to be people that are a little bit looser than me. Okay? But watch this. They're still in the stream. They're still in the stream. All right, let's illustrate this. What are some of the issues that you can either be really strict on or a little bit looser on? What are some of those issues? Somebody say one. Don't be afraid.
Dress.
Okay, your appearance. Modesty issues, right? Dress code. I'll just put them over here. Okay, what else? Entertainment. A lot of these are cultural issues. But what else?
Bible version.
Oh, nobody wanted to say it, right? Thank you, Katie. Right? Thanks, Jay. Translation or whatever text. It is funny that some people want to make it all about the text when it's really, if you really talk to them about it, it's really about the translation for them, not the text. But there's a whole nother talk we could have about that. But okay, dress, entertainment, text, the scripture text, not texting. Okay. What else? Well, we talked about it earlier, music, right? Worship. What else? What about some nuances theologically? Right? Nobody wants to say them. What are they? Soteriology, right? So are they Calvinistic or are they Arminian? Are they Arminian? Which way we say do they lean? See, don't you see what I'm saying? Yeah, So maybe it's our salvation theology, and we could even dig down deeper, and we can even go to things like the order of salvation. Right? Order saluta. It's a theological term. So issues of theology. Okay, I would say now that I'm in an actual theological institution, I promise you there are a lot of these. You know what I've also learned is our history is there's people who are really a right side on Baptist heritage. Okay, do you believe trail of blood? Right, that Jesus was a Baptist, which the trail of blood tries to prove that it goes all the way back to Jesus. Do you believe a modified successionistic position? Or do you believe an English separatist position? Are you guys familiar with some of this? Right? I was traveling around the country, and I was talking about my Baptist history class, and I was talking about kind of my view of Baptist heritage, and I had no idea that actually there are people that actually view this issue and respond to this issue as a separation issue. Okay? We could even put on here like closed or open communion, our baptism, things like that. Anything else like our view of dispensationalism, our hermeneutics, right? We could go on, and if we started listing everything particularly, we would have a full chalkboard of things that, watch this, people in the stream can disagree about. It's true. You can have differing positions on all these things. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we shouldn't know where our line is. We should know exactly where our line is personally for our ministries. I just showed you that. We ought to know our philosophy. We ought to know why we're doing it. We ought to get the people to support it. We ought to build the programs around it. But when we show deference to people that are fundamentalists, they're in the stream. Now, if we could really have fun with this. We could start naming like the colleges, right? One thing that puts us in the stream is what I already said. The 2 C's of separation: cultural and church separation. Which is why, just since I'm in the state of Ohio, I would put Cedarville outside the stream. Okay. They're doing a lot of wonderful things. They're questionable, definitely in my categories of the 4 men, the 4 stick men. Okay, but they're not ecclesiastically separating the way the true fundamentalists should, like I showed you, and they're not standing strong on cultural, personal separation issues. And one of the defining issues that you see there is their worship, which typically does help you see where they stand culturally. Okay, so I'm not saying everybody's in the stream as long as they give the gospel. I'm saying people that agree with a cultural and a church separation principles can be in this stream. This is really interesting because right now there are people in this room that will in their minds, they'll think that the people on the right side are not in the stream. And then there's other people in this room that might be thinking, you maybe are more on the right side, and you're thinking that the people that are on the left side are not in the stream. All right, I'll give you an illustration. So I travel the country. I literally could be in one church one week where the guy is calling a pastor that I know a heretic because he's using something other than the King James. The very next week, I could be in a church where a guy is using the ESV, and he thinks the guy I was just with, I'm just using this as a hypothetical, he thinks literally that the guy I was with, who believes that the King James Version is the only English translation anybody should ever read, he believes he's a heretic. And they're both calling each other heretics, and actually they're both fundamentalists. They're both in the stream. Okay, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Can I just encourage you about something? The H word, heretic. I think that we should kind of reserve that word for people that we're confident are unbelievers. I understand the Greek word means divisions. Trust me, I know that. I understand that if you look it up, you find places in the scripture, it's the word divide. But historically and culturally now, the word has a very strong meaning. What do we do with people that are heretics? Well, in history, they would burn them. So they were saying, you're outside the faith. I personally reserve the word heretic for people that are outside of the faith. Joel Osteen is a heretic. Okay. I do. I believe I can say that pretty strongly. The scripture tells us we can call out apostates. We can call out people like that. But somebody that uses a different translation than me is not a heretic. They're not. Now, there would be an issue of the text that may be close to outside of the faith. It's typically what's called Ruckmanism, something, where they're actually saying that the King James English translation is inspired and that you don't even need the Greek. That's an attack on the inspiration of Scripture. But I have very rarely heard anybody ever espouse a position. Let me just say, I do believe there are categories in each of these issues where I would wonder if they're even in the river. But what I'm saying is there's a wide room for disagreement. Brother Andy and I were talking about this yesterday. I'm as you can see, I'm kind of a simple-minded thinker in this, but I hope that there's some depth to what I'm saying, okay? But anyways, I want my circle of understanding and belief to be very, very tight on everything. I'm telling you, if you talk to me about any of these issues, I would be able to tell you specific details, first of all, for my own life. And honestly, I think the most important influence I have is with my family and my children. I have 4 daughters. So let me just tell you, this has been very important in my family. We've been talking about it for years. I get really emotional about this because I'm thankful now I see my adult daughters, and they believe it. They espouse it themselves. I don't even have to hardly talk to them at all ever anymore because they have caught the philosophy. And I've tried to teach it to them and demonstrated that. Of course, my wife is a great example of that as well. But so we have particular things that we've taught in our family. If you came to me and you talked to me about any of these issues, you might walk away saying, Brother Mark is really conservative. That I am. I know what I do and why I do it, by God's grace. But I also understand that literally in every one of these issues, if we were to talk about theology, areas of soteriology and hermeneutics and things, in all of these issues, I also understand I could be wrong. I could be wrong. That's a humble statement that we should acknowledge to ourselves. Maybe I'm missing something on some of these things. So my circle can be pretty small. My circle of my communication and my explanation of what I believe. But watch this. I think that my circle of acceptance can be actually fairly large. circle of acceptance can be fairly large. But you still see there is a place that outside. This is really, really tough because we think we're right. If I didn't think I was right, I wouldn't teach anything that I teach. Of course I think I'm right. Let me give you an illustration of this. I teach the public worship course to my preacher boys. I have a young man who is from he is from a Reformed church that is about an hour north of Maranatha. And literally, when he came on campus, he was one of the first guys I met that freshman year. I introduced myself to him and his mom, and we struck up a friendship immediately. I found out he was from a Reformed Church of America church that is an hour north of us, and the primary reason he was coming to Maranatha was he realized that the environment that we had was way better than the schools they were recommending him going to. But I immediately in my mind thought, oh, here's an opportunity for us to maybe shape his thinking in a different direction. And lo and behold, he comes in the first day of my class. Freshman year, he's sitting in my theology of worship class. And guess what? He is the worship leader of his contemporary worship kind of band and worship team at their church. He's sitting in my worship class. And you think, well, this was your opportunity to put it to him, right? You know what? I practice in that class exactly as I seek to practice everywhere I go, and I want to clearly communicate what I'm going to do, what I believe, and I want to give people freedom to discuss it. I want to give people freedom to be different than me. And you know what? He still does not believe. He does not believe in a conservative view of worship when it comes to pop music in the church. But he and I have had conversations about so many wonderful things. I'm telling you, God has a special place for him. I probably I'll never approve of using Christian rock in the church. I won't, because this is me. And there may come a time where he's leading a congregation that is even outside my circle of acceptance. I would probably describe my circle of preference or my circle of acceptance here in the music area is basically if they're utilizing rock styles in their worship services, then I feel like that's going to be outside of my ability to accept. And that's where I probably would draw a line. But as I've already told you, within Maranatha's sphere, we have about 100 partnering churches. There are many of those churches that I would never feel comfortable joining myself personally, because this is who I am. But they're accepted in our circumference of churches because they haven't gone so far on any of these issues that they're outside of the realm of a partnering church. All right, that's just another example. Okay, so what I'm saying is for me personally and for the people that I'm influencing, I don't want them to be over here. And I don't want them to be over here. I don't want any of my guys to graduate and be basically, everybody's kind of going, are they a evangelical or are they a conservative? There are people that are on the fence, they're on the line. I think a part of a right philosophy is we shouldn't confuse people by being on either radical side. So the two things I say to my students all the time that I feel like has been helpful for me to think about is number one, stay away from extremes. And number two, do not be reactionary. Because this is exactly what I've seen through the years. Young guys who are raised in a right-wing fundamentalist church, they're in the stream, but they're maybe hyper on the text, hyper King James. They're like still propagating a very, very strict view of dress code. They are, maybe they're really strong Baptist heritage or whatever. I mean, there's examples of this. Okay, and they grew up in that type of ministry, and you know what they do? Sometimes they completely jump out of the stream. So they go. Whatever this is, I don't like it. and they jump out of the stream, and often they're over here. I got a bunch of friends like that. But sometimes what happens is they say, no, you know what, I still want to stay in the stream, and so we just go over here. And then they're on a situation where they're on the very left edge of the stream, and they don't have a lot of unity with anybody, because they're shooting darts at the guys on the right side of the stream. By the way, both sides are shooting at each other a lot. When really, they should be kind of getting along as much as possible within the stream. Okay? For me as an evangelist, I had to practice exactly this almost every week of my life. Because I was in churches where there are a few churches around the country where I would absolutely join that church, and I would be a member of that church and fully support the philosophy. But I will tell you, probably a good percentage of the churches that I actually ministered in as a fundamentalist evangelist, I actually wouldn't probably put my family in that church. But I would still go there and minister. And what was interesting is that you would hear all these conversations about, like I said, one week I'd be on this guy's church, and he'd be telling me how bad all those other guys are over here. And the very next week, I'd be at this guy's church, and he'd be saying, those guys over there are this and this and this. And it's just, what I'm trying to show is that we can accept a variety of positions. We can accept a variety of positions in this circle. And really where the rubber hits the road is what is the line we draw on these issues where they're actually outside of acceptability and where we actually draw a strong sphere of influence decision. Okay? If I were to go down through this, I could tell you kind of where I'm at on some of these things. Right? The dress code, I feel like there's a balanced position. I actually feel like the position we practice at Maranatha, which was there before I got there. It's not anything I instituted. I think it's a pretty balanced approach, and that is, what are the principles of dress? Modesty, distinct, right, and appropriate. By the way, that's the reason why I can say that to you so quickly, is that's what we've talked about with my kids for years and years and years. The first important thing is modesty. Modesty is not just covering. Modesty is how you carry yourself too. So I have at Maranatha we have a modesty policy. So we want everything, whatever they're wearing, needs to be, for guys or girls, needs to be drawing attention to the right things in how they carry themselves and how they cover themselves. Secondly, they need to be distinctively male or female. Okay, which is real sad to say, it's a confusion in our world today. But the dress code needs to showcase either feminine or masculine as best as possible. Okay, so we have expectations for that. And then thirdly, there's an appropriateness issue, which is why we still actually, and this is the primary reason why we still actually require all of our girl students to wear a little bit dressier. They wear skirts and dresses to class and chapel. But anytime they're not in class and chapel, they can wear loose fitting and knee length, basically any pants or garment in that category. And I think actually that's a really good balance, because we're showcasing that there's certain occasions where you ought to be dressed up, and there are other occasions where it's casual. But all of it needs to be modest. Okay, so where I would draw the line here is, it's really disappointing to me to see a lot of the churches and institutions that are basically taking more of an evangelical model of modesty, and that is, don't draw too many lines, don't have too high of expectations, and definitely don't enforce too strongly. And I think that is where it's getting into a little bit of an unacceptable category. And I'll just be honest with you, I wouldn't want to send if I'm leading a church, I wouldn't want to send my young men or young ladies to a place where they're not going to have a strong philosophy of dress code and appearance. I believe that's important. And so there's a line that, in my mind, that would be crossed. The entertainment area as well, I think that, you know, there's a lot that we could talk about there. I think there's some things that we face today in our culture with streaming devices that, you know, we can take some of the old rules, like don't go to a movie theater, and we can say, actually, in order to be consistent, then you would have to say that if that's a bad testimony, then you shouldn't really have an iPad at all. Because you can literally watch everything. If you're going to say that the testimony issue is the main issue of going to a movie theater, you can't be consistent with that unless you're going to tell everybody they can't have any device. So really the issue is not the theater, it's what's being watched at the theater. And so I think that we should understand the culture in those areas and make some changes and draw some lines in the entertainment. We could go on and on. I don't want to belabor the point. Let me just say, in the area of theology, I don't want to be an anti-Calvinist, but I don't want to be a strong Calvinist either. That's what I'm saying. Be in the middle of the stream. I don't want people to call me a Calvinist, but I will tell you, it's kind of funny because literally I have some of my friends that think I'm a Calvinist. And then there's other of my friends that absolutely know I'm not one. Because they're a Calvinist. Okay, that sounds really funny, but that kind of shows you the kind of balance that I'm hoping to see. But what I'm saying is I'm not actually looking for Calvinism under every ministerial rock, if I can say it that way. Like, check his doctrinal statement. Well, I heard him. He preached you're chosen in him before the fountain. He must be a Calvinist. You know what? Honestly, as far as I'm concerned, as long as they're evangelistic and they're humble and they're not bringing it into every sermon that they preach, I don't mind if somebody articulates their soteriology a little bit different than me. And by the way, throughout all of fundamentalist history, we've had Arminians and Calvinists in the stream. So that does not make somebody in the stream or out of the stream. Same with like even covenant theology, and which I'm not a covenant hermeneutic guy at all. I'm a dispensationalist. But you know what I found? There are some people that you're not even in the stream if you're not their kind of dispensationalist. Like if you don't believe in the way they believe in dispensationalism, they're very suspect of you. But what I'm saying is I would even put some guys in the stream that are actually not even Baptist. Or not even, maybe they're not even dispensationalists, but they're culturally and church-wise, their ecclesiastical and cultural separation demands that I allow them to be in the stream. Okay? Because of my influence, I may not ever preach at a faith-free Presbyterian church. But a faith-free Presbyterian is a separatist and they're fundamentalist. I wouldn't preach there because I'm a Baptist and I work at a Baptist school. But they're not a non-fundamentalist. Does that make sense? I know I'm throwing out a lot of this, okay? Just kind of casting it out there, right? Like drinking from a fire hydrant. There's probably a lot, and there probably are a lot of issues that we could talk about and debate about and discuss, and I'm okay doing that. That's fine. I don't really care. I don't have to pin everybody right where I am. That's what I'm saying. This is the humility that I'm talking about. But then at the same time, there are things that are outside the stream, that take people outside the stream, and those are the people that we have to be careful about our associations with. And like I said, I do believe there's on the right and the left. All right, we have time. Maybe I know that we're supposed to dismiss for lunch, right? Is that right? Anybody have a quick question? Any question that you want to ask about that? Somehow I knew you would have a question.
Yeah, I know. You said that after a while they thought a question stirs the conscience, and I didn't.
Accusation stirs the will.
Accusation.